If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, I'd hammer in the evening, all over this land. I'd hammer out danger, I'd hammer out a warning, I'd hammer out love between my brothers and my sisters.
My name is Debra Sweet. I'm the director of World Can't Wait. We convened this panel today, and we're doing others that you'll get a list of. This is one of the most important. I'm going to be introducing 4 speakers. I'll introduce them all right now, and then they will talk one by one, but we are very interested in focusing on 2 points. And you could think about this for your questions as well. We've asked the panelists to consider what are the most critical parts of the revelations that have come out on NSA surveillance, and also, very importantly, what is it that people here should be doing about it? What should be our response? So let these questions circulate as you're listening to the panelists. First, we're going to hear from Binney, William Binney, who many of you obviously have heard of. He was one of the first NSA whistleblowers. He has quite a long history with NSA and in the surveillance business. And yet armed men broke into his bathroom.
Surprise, surprise.
With guns drawn, because he is a threat to the state. And we're going to hear more about that. Ray McGovern. Ray McGovern has very importantly stuck his neck out in many venues to challenge the U.S. war machine. He also has a long history, very important history of standing up to this after having left the CIA as an intelligence analyst and briefer. And we're very fortunate to hear from him. Kevin Gosztola. Has a lot of followers on Twitter. He writes for the Dissenter blog on Fire Dog Lake. I know him as a college activist back in the Bush regime days when he made a wonderful video for World Can't Wait called The World Can Wait. It was sarcastic. And we have our colleague from National Lawyers Guild, Abi, and he is not standing in for, but is part of the work of Heidi Boghossian, who has written a major book on U.S. government spying this week. And the National Lawyers Guild as a whole has been very involved in these issues and has a lot to bring to the table about what this means, especially for people in this country. I hope you will give full attention. Obviously, we have a number of people videotaping, audio taping. We're working hard on getting some electronics set up so that we can actually show you some things that the speakers brought. If that works, it'll be wonderful. If not, we have their heads, their hearts, and their intellect, which is the most important part. So I'd like to start off with Bill Binney.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all. Thanks for inviting me. And it's always a pleasure for me to come to help explain some of this stuff to everybody that I've taught, because it's a lot of things being confused by our government. They're telling you basically lies and misrepresentation, so that you think that what they're doing is not that malicious, okay? That's really what they're doing. But this all started because, first of all, the programs I ran inside NSA were designed to help manage the digital age, which meant how can you manage massive amounts of information and reduce it to the point where you can focus it in and make sure that you can information that's relevant to the targets you're really at. That meant, you know, terrorists and dope smugglers and money launderers and things like that, criminal activity around the world. So my entire approach was to do a focused attack, but at the same time I had to design it in such a way that it could manage all the terabytes of data being passed around every minute. So I had to be able to scan through, be able to select information out. So that's the system I designed. But as a part of that process, I knew there was danger in that. So I built in a process to recognize, first of all citizens of the United States and encrypt all of their values, that is, hide their identities, as we saw them coming across the data. If they got pulled in with all this, for example, if a U.S. citizen was talking to someone that they thought was a terrorist, we would have the attributes of that citizen and be able to identify them, like their phone number or IP or, you know, a bank account number or credit card, something like that. If we pulled that data in, then it would automatically be encrypted so that no database in the NSA or anywhere else would have that data other than it under an encryption. So that would hide their identity. No one in the agents in the NSA or anywhere in the government, in the FBI or DEA, could go in to find anyone in that data. So that was how we were protecting identities. And that was only if you got caught pulling in terms of contacting or having a relationship with somebody who was suspected of something wrong. Okay. Otherwise, your data was not taken in at all, because it was easy to recognize, either in a phone network or in the internet, all the identities of U.S. citizens or U.S.-based people internally in this country. Even if you go overseas, your cell phone carries the phone numbers of your local phone number, which identifies you as a citizen of the United States, or you got the phone number from the United States. So there were ways to do that and ways to tackle that. If there was any suspicion, we would take a look at that and then resolve it one way or another, or delete you, or purge your information from the database. That was the whole process before 9/11. But General Hayden, Bush, and Cheney, and his compatriots in law, like you and various others, like Addington and Gonzalez, all conspired to concoct a preposterous statement that they're under the War Powers Act, they can take in anything they want. Well, as I asked my lawyers, when was war declared by Congress? Never was, and so therefore they had no legal grounds to advocate that they can use the War Powers Act. So that basically was the start of it, but initially all the bulk acquisition was directed against this country, all the citizens in this country, not foreigners. Okay, so that was the first take-in. They started with AT&T that I know of. They gained about 320 million records every day of your calls back to one another domestically. That didn't count any foreigners. It's all domestic communications. So then from there it branched out into emails with the narrowest devices on the fiber optic lines. And I had some slides here I wanted to show, if we can show them up. But it'll show you how the network, how it's grown over time. These are slides that have been released by Edward Snowden. And although Clapper, our DNI, doesn't want any former employees of the intelligence community talking about any of the slides, I still have a First Amendment right to talk about anything in the public domain.
I'm going to tell.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell on you.
Okay. So I figured I'd just do it anyway. All right? So that you could get an idea of what they're really doing.
Bill, would you title this?
It's a relationship analysis.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but the point is, it started with all U.S. citizens. Now I knew the power that the first thing they did with it was to remove all the encryptions and protections of your identities.
But you don't have.
So now they know everybody.
You need to get down.
All the data was laying there for, and the primary user here is the FBI and the DEA, law enforcement. Mm-hmm. It is not for terrorism. The domestic collection is not for terrorism, it's for law enforcement. They have direct access to these databases and they're using them to arrest people. And I'll show you some slides too. That's also on the web.
Shoot from there and turn the computer around.
That was part of Thin Thread, yeah. Right. That was one of the, but that was only one input, okay? This took every input that the agency had, everyone. and also other agencies. So it was a composite of the entire intelligence community, basically. And numbers, by the way, meant nothing. We would take trillions of transactions and reduce them to tens of billions of relationships, and it would be easy to manage. And also kept frequency counts so we knew the valid relationships and repeated relationships and timeline and things like that. And I have some slides to show you that. And that's basically why I said they have a dossier on everybody in the United States. Alexander said they didn't. Our people don't do that. That's right. His people don't. The software does. Okay. It's all done by software. This is all automatic. This was 15 years ago.
Without the dongle, it's not, unless someone has a PC laptop.
Hey, Bill,
Yes.
it's we don't have the cord, but I have the presentation here in case you wanted to read parts of it off for people.
So, okay.
I don't know if that's how you want to do it.
Does anybody have a Mac VGA dongle?
Yeah, I do.
Hey, I'm bringing this over.
Oh, okay, so
I'll get it for you.
oh, here, I'll take this. I actually want these.
Coming together to make it happen.
But at any rate, when
is this the one?
the Bush administration started, this was the first thing I objected to.
Yeah, I think so.
When the Bush administration started this spying on U.S. citizens, this was the first thing I realized what they were doing. This is a totalitarian procedure. This was done by the KGB, the Stasi, the Gestapo. This is what they all did, except they didn't do it quite as well. Okay, so I refer to this as the Stasi on steroids. Okay, so because it means you can do everybody all the time, as often as you want throughout the day. Watch them, everything they're doing. Every electronic thing you do in life can be recorded, stored, timelined, analyzed in a profile of you. That's your dossier. That's what they have. When you compile that data, that's what the software will do. And now they're still having trouble analyzing it because they don't have the automated programs to go through and figure out what it means or what's significant or important there. So that's why they issued the White House Big Data Initiative back in early 2012, I think it was, soliciting private industry to come up with algorithms to go through large data sets to figure out what's important there, so they don't have to use people because they can't get to it. It's like when you're after a target and you use a Google query, for example,
Yeah, you're good.
and you get hundreds of thousands, if not millions of returns, you can't get through them. Well, that's the output every day of stuff they take in. So every day, the next day, you get another hundreds of thousands or millions, and you can't get through that. So you can't get through this data. That's why they need these automated algorithms. So it basically means they're dysfunctional. That's why they can't stop the Boston bombing, the Fort Hood shooting, the Times Square bombing, even though the malfunction, it was still, the fellow made it to the Times Square and tried to detonate it. They couldn't stop that. It was only local law enforcement that did that, right? And someone who observed what they were doing. And also, they didn't stop the underwear bomber or any real bombing threat. They didn't stop, right? They were pretty good at stopping people by.
All right, Bill, we've got your slides.
Oh, good. Okay. All right. Well, this was kind of some of the electronic input that they would take in. You turn on your computer, you drive around with your cell phone. They can take the GPS off you that way, or you can go through. You have an Easy Pass card, and they can check you as you're moving along, or any kind of electronic deal. Use your credit cards, anything. So that's what that simply means. So then, what I did was I went through the web and I looked up all of the. We can go through the next 3 slides pretty quickly. I was looking at all these companies and all the fiber optic lines they had. It's all on the web, by the way. And you can look and see where major fibers converge. Now that's a primary point to put collection devices, because then you can see multiple fibers simultaneously. Gives you the maximum look at what's going on. And so I said, well, okay, if 3 or more fibers converging in a city is a primary place for them to put Naris or Barent or other recording devices for phone calls and things like that. And so these were the cities, and you could just click through the next 2 slides. And it goes around the world. This is not locally. Although 80% roughly of the fiber optic lines come through the United States, that gives us the hometown advantage for looking at worldwide communications. So that's one of the main reasons. There's more in there. Now, this was a very important slide. Although everybody focused on the PRISM part of it, that's not the important part. The important part is the upstream. That's where all of the fiber collection is done. That's near real-time acquisition of data. That's where they record phone calls and they take in all your email, chatter, whatever you're doing on the web. that's where that's acquired. The PRISM stuff simply backs it up. This is the program they call Fairview, and this shows you where these fiber taps are in the continental United States. Now, if they were after foreigners, all they'd do is put them all along the coast where the transoceanic cables come up, okay? Because that's where they could see foreigners communicating. But all the stuff inside the country, that's not foreign collection. That's all domestic. And that's what they're collecting, and that's why they have to build Bluffdale and other storage facilities, like the one, the 600,000 square foot facility on Fort Meade, because they're collecting this. And this, of course, extends worldwide, but this is the U.S. part of it. This is where they really started, and this is really where the bulk acquisition of data comes, because we communicate more than most people anyway in the United States. So,
Bluffdale is
in Utah, that's the big 1 million square foot storage facility they put out there. I originally estimated it to be something like 5 zettabytes of storage. And I took that, I mean, Cisco, who manufactures routers for them, and they buy routers from Cisco, estimated the transition of data into that facility to be at 966 exabytes a year, which if you allow them, say, at least a minimum of five years of storage, that's 5 zettabytes, roughly. So if they do, I always tell this joke, if you do, you know, after the zettabyte is yotta bytes, right? And then they don't have anything after yotta. So, but if they make a breakthrough in quantum storage and quantum computing, then yotta's not enough. So we need another one. So I propose that we make that one a lot of bytes. A lot of bytes, all right. Or a bunch of bytes or something, you know?
Bunch of bytes.
Something silly. But at any rate, you know, that's the idea. They're gaining more capacity to acquire information and store it. Storage is getting really cheap and small, and you can get a lot of data in a very small space. Well, now they have a lot of space to store a lot of data and the means to get it. That's what that other is. Now, when it comes to looking at this data, here's how basically you filter out all U.S. communications. It's real simple. The public switch telephone network worldwide is numbered in 5 zones of the world. Zone 1 is the U.S. and Canada and some of the islands. Zone 2 is Africa. 3 and 4 are Europe. 5 is South America. 6 is Australia, a little bit of Southeast Asia. And 7 Russia, and 8 and 9 and the rest of Asia and South Asia. So when you make a phone call, right, you dial 0 from the United States, you dial 01 or 011. The next number you dial is what zone of the world you're going to, right? And the next number after that is the key, it's the switch, basically, to the country. So there's a country code under it. Like if you went to, okay. But anyway, that tells you how the whole thing is numbered. That means you can identify. I mean, you have to tell these switches what to do. This is done automatically by a switch. That's how caller ID works. Okay? So these numbers are going through. That's how it gets routed. So there's no excuse for not knowing that somebody from San Diego calls somebody in Yemen. Right? None at all. There's no excuse for that. In fact, they didn't. They knew that all along. The part about we didn't know that was an outright lie. So at any rate, just to separate U.S. citizens or U.S. domestic communications, just looking at it, right up front, if you're anywhere in the world, you dial 00 if you're trying to get out of your country. If you're in the United States, it's 01 or 011. That means one end's guaranteed to be foreign, if not both are foreign. But if you hit one, both ends are in the U.S. So that means right away you can separate all domestic communications from everything else as it occurs. And the same is true with the IP numbers, IPv4 and IPv6 and the internet. Or you can use MAC numbers or anything else that as long as you know the blockings and all the numbering schemes, then you can separate all that out instantaneously as that data is passed. Because the machines have to know to route it, and this is how they route it. Okay? So even if they give you a temporary IP, it still is from the block of the world that you're in. So if you're coming from zone 2, using a temporary from zone 2, that means right away you're known to be foreign. So that separates that all right away. So there's no excuse for not being able to determine domestic communications instantaneously, either in the public switch telephone network or the internet, using this approach. In fact, that's the way we did it. So then this is the breakdown of the internet. 5 zones of the world, it's not 9, and they just get them blocks. So the next slide. And then our whole idea here was to have a zone of suspicion. So we would look at a zone of suspicion along relationships. That is, it's very simple. You needed We needed a quick reaction interrogation file so you could get through data passing by at terabytes. So you have to be really quick. You can't. If something starts backing up, you're going to fail. So we did a real quick index, which is simply a flat file, B plus 3 index. A has a relationship to B, and B has a relationship. You do the reverse, B is to A. So if you query A, you get B. If you query B, you get A. So that gives you all those answers by indexing that way. So that made it easy for us to look things up as they were going by, as to whether we wanted them, they were a known target, or, you know, it's in the U.S., we would use the other schemes, right? Domestic, we could separate all that. It was really pretty simple. So we could manage 20 terabytes a minute. And if we had trouble with that, up to that point, we would simply replicate another processor and do 20 more terabytes. Depending on how much we needed space and power. That was the problem. So at any rate, that zone of suspicion was only 2 degrees around any relationships we were building. So that gave you a focused attack, right? You weren't scarfing up everybody in the world. You only focused on things that were in a zone of suspicion. You would add other things, like if somebody was frequently visiting sites advocating terror, or sites advocating jihad, you know, or other kinds of activities that might be dope related, or if they're using satellite phones in the mountains of Afghanistan, likely terrorists, you know, or the same is true in the jungles of Colombia, it might be a dope smuggler. So you look at them for those reasons, and that also adds people to that zone of suspicion. But you're doing it for a reason, okay? You're not scarfing up everybody, because you don't. First of all, when you scarf up everybody, it gives you so much data, your analysts are dysfunctional. Okay, that was fundamentally true even before 9/11, before they did the bulk acquisition. They did the bulk acquisition, they gave them orders of magnitude more data, and so their analysts are orders of magnitude more buried. So they're not solving anything. That's why they're not discovering and stopping these terrorist attacks. So they don't have a focused approach, and they aren't doing things smartly. That's the problem. That's because there is an awful lot of money in doing it the way they're doing it.
Right.
Okay? $2 billion just to build Bluffdale, because you have a lot of data. If you do this attack, you don't need Bluffdale. Wow. That's the difference. And all those companies and all the money, the tens of billions every year that they get, roughly $70 billion a year goes to contracts for the intelligence community. So that's since 9/11. What's that? Almost $1 trillion, okay? We're getting close to that. So that's an awful lot of money. That's an awful lot of jobs and a bureaucracy, right? And an employment factory when you retire from the U.S. government. That's called incestuous relationships. That's exactly what it is. And that's the motive behind all of this. So at any rate, these are things you can't do if you use encryption on the thing. Using encryption, you can't go in and interrogate things. You can't randomly, if I wanted to get any one of you, I couldn't find you in the base, because all the values are encrypted, and I don't have a knowledge what the encryption value is. I could go request a decryption from the courts if they would have, if I had probable cause, but that would have to happen. See, that was the whole idea. And it made it unusable to law enforcement. It was impossible for them to use it. It was even impossible for NSA analysts to do love-int. They couldn't go in and look at their lovers or wives or anything and see if they were cheating on them. That was impossible now. They couldn't do it. So, but this is what they removed, okay, from the process in 2001, because their objective was law enforcement and lots of money and building an empire, and that's exactly what they've done. Okay, next. You can skip through this. This slide goes simply stepping through to show how that process would work. And this is what a timeline would look. You list all the attributes down the side and it gives you activity over time. Yeah. And then you index it down here. If you have data, like an email or a phone call transcript or an audio, you have it indexed here, and then you can point to it up there, and it'll pull it out, and you can listen to it or read it. So the point is that it gives you a package to identify and isolate all the activity you're doing. Bank transfers, phone calls, emails, whatever. All of it's done by software. No human intervention at all. And that was 15 years ago. Now what they do with the data is they do this, the Special Operations Division of the Drug Enforcement Agency is the one responsible to look into the NSA collected data for criminal activity. And so what they're doing is they have to have rules on how to use this data, because it's not acquired with a warrant, so it's not admissible in court. So you can't just You can't just take that data into court and use it to convict people. So here are the rules that they've adopted. You can't talk about it to the courts, to the attorneys, or anything, or even to foreign counterparts if you're going to tip them off as to criminal activity. And then the next slide. So in order to do that, what they do is, can we flip to the next slide there, Kevin? Yeah. Okay. There. They do a parallel construction. Okay, the parallel construction simply says, all right, you know where all the data is, so go do your normal investigation techniques that you usually would do to find information, and of course you know where it is to begin with, so it makes it pretty easy. So they go find it that way, and then they come back and say, here's the data we use to get probable cause to arrest this person. Okay, so what that means is, and I call this a planned program perjury policy run by the Department of Justice of the United States. They're framing people with this data, and they're perjuring themselves in court. In fact, the latest perjury, the Solicitor General of the United States lied to the Supreme Court to get the Amnesty International versus Clapper thrown out. He said that all the data that NSA collected, if it was ever used against somebody in court, that the defendant would be told, so that they could, have the right to challenge discovery, and they would have their constitutional rights in court. Well, that was a lie. They never did any of that, and now he's scrambling to try to find out how many cases have they used the NSA data. Senator Feinstein said, a couple hundred people a year have been picked up by this at one point in the Judiciary Committee. That's why this program is important. Okay, so we can perjure ourselves several hundred times a year to just convict people. This is fundamentally corrupting and subverting the entire judicial system of the United States and every democracy in the world. This is subverting the entire, like for example, just collecting the metadata tells me who you talk to. That's a violation of your First Amendment rights of free association. Right? And then collecting the emails and everything, that's a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights. And your Fifth Amendment rights, because I'll use that against you in court, and I'll do a parallel construction to convict you. This is a total rotting of the foundation of our republic. And it affects everybody. Not only now, but just the understanding that you're being watched in such a way with this kind of malicious intent kind of eats at your feeling of the ability to be creative and innovative. That destroys your civilization. I mean, look what happened to the Soviet Union, a bunch of drunkards under the Soviets, or the East Germans under the Stasi. That's what happens when you have this kind of state. This is where we are.
Thank you, Bill.
Sorry.
Just so everybody knows, Bill took the train up from DC just for this panel and has to leave pretty quickly afterwards, but we have a little space before your train, so if people really want to ask him questions, maybe he can stay around for a little bit in this room. Ray McGovern, please.
Thanks, Gary. If I had asked something to be put in queue, is it in there? Do you know?
Put it in. I can help you out.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have our resident
All right.
tech
It's
crew here on this end of the table.
Michael Hayden and National Press Club. January.
Oh, you want to pull up on the internet?
Yeah, but I don't need it until I signal. Well, thanks very much. You know, this is an incredible treat to be here in my native New York. See old friends and new friends that I picked up along the way, like Medea Benjamin and Peter Van Buren, talk about whistleblowers. Peter now lives here, so those of you who do not know Peter, look him up, Google him, and see what kind of courage is now descended to add to the courage already here in New York. I don't know if your kids played this game, but mine used to play crooks and liars, or crooks and robbers or something. And I wish I could be a little bit more upbeat than my friend Bill has been. But I think you need to have some context. A context that shows that the highest ranked military officers in our country are a bunch of crooks and robbers. And no better example than with the NSA directors over the years. And I'd like to just kind of set the stage by kind of reviewing some of the things that have happened. Over at NSA, there used to be something called the First Commandment. Anybody know what that is? Thou shalt not eavesdrop on American citizens without a warrant. Okay. Now, it didn't always be so rigorously adhered to, but after the indignities and the crimes that were revealed in the 70s and the FISA Act came in, well, here's an example. I was on the receiving end of some of these intercepted messages, and many of them came in with razor holes on the sheets, okay? We didn't have computers in those days. And I asked the first time, I said, razor hole, what's this? It was the names of American citizens. They wouldn't take the chance of just blackening them out. They razored them out. That's how seriously, you remember that, Peter? That's how seriously NSA took that obligation. Now, fast forward to 2001, before 9/11. I say again, before 9/11. Cheney and Bush called General Michael Hayden, who was head of the NSA, in at the time, and they said, now, General Hayden, we know about that First Commandment out there in NSA, but we want to tell you, forget about it. Forget about it. We know about the Fourth Amendment Constitution, but we have some special instructions for you. Go out there, make sure you get backdoors to AT&T, Verizon, everybody else. And that happened again before 9/11. Now, after 9/11, of course, it went on steroids. I mean, there's no denying that. It really went on steroids. And so what do we have after 9/11? Well, we have this full program, indiscriminate monitoring and direct violation of the Fourth Amendment. And, you know, when I go on radio or TV, I always try to say to the interviewer, the Fourth Amendment is only one sentence. Okay if I say it? And then before they can react, I say, the Fourth Amendment says the right of the citizens to be secure. So we're talking secure here. We're talking security, okay? The right of citizens to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue except upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly defining the place to be searched or the person or thing to be seized, period. Okay? What could be clearer than that? Probable cause. Now, after NSA was set loose on us as well as everyone else, James Risen of the New York Times found out about it. And anybody know when he found out about that? The summer of 2004. Okay? And that was an election year. And so Risen went to his uppers at the New York Times and said, "This is pretty explosive stuff, but you know it's got to be published." And they said, "Well, let's check that out with the White House." That's the way the New York Times works now. See, they and the White House know best what we should know about. Okay, and so Bush put his foot. Terrorism, national security, 9/11, terrorism, national security, can't do it. And so Risen was prevented from telling the story for the last few months before the election 2004. Fast forward to December of 2005, folks. Risen goes to Sulzberger and his uppers at the Times and says, you know, I know it's going to be a little awkward for you guys because my book is in galley. And I'm making big bucks from you all, and you haven't put a story out about how the Bush administration is illegally collecting, eavesdropping, and so forth. And so Sulzberger said, "Oh my goodness, we better go down." So he called Bush, and Bush said, "Well, come down the Oval Office." And they had this big dispute. And Bush said, 9/11, terrorism, 9/11, national security. And Sulzberger said, "Oh, come on, come on. We held off for 15, 16 months. It'd be too embarrassing. I got it. So I don't agree." So we left out. Okay, now that was the 4th of December, 2005 now, all right? Now, on the 5th of December, poor General Alexander out there at NSA, nobody thought to tell him that the cat was out of the bag. Okay? And so Rush Holt, congressman from New Jersey, to his great credit, is going on one of his parish calls to NSA. NSA was in his portfolio as a member of the House Intelligence Committee. And he said, General Alexander, I have heard rumors that NSA is eavesdropping on Americans without court warrant. Is that true? He said, oh, perish the thought. Never would we do that. 16th of December, the story comes out of the New York Times. Rush Holt is in high dudgeon. He says, this guy is never going to get another star if I have anything to do with it. And indeed, Alexander didn't get his 4th star for 3 or 4 years. But then he became head of the Cyber Command, as well as NSA. One of the most powerful people in the world, much less Washington. So that's the kind of people we're dealing with here. Carry the story forward here. Hayden was made the deputy National Intelligence Officer. Now, National Intelligence Director now, of course, is James Clapper, holier than Caesar's wife. He was made the deputy, that is, Hayden was, and so he was given the task of explaining all this to the press when it became known through the New York Times and through Ryzen that NSA was scooping up all this information. And he did a great job. Did a fantastic job. As a matter of fact, I have a clip here. Could we
Actually, you're going to have to paraphrase the evil.
Oh, I'm going to have to paraphrase. Well, I have a clip of 90 seconds, and it has Hayden up before the National Press Club. And Jonathan Landy, some of you know him as a pretty gutsy McClatchy reporter, says, General Hayden, how do you explain what NSA has been doing? Because, you know, the Fourth Amendment, which regulates such activity, has probable cause. How can you scoop up everything without probable cause? And Hayden says, there's no probable cause in the Fourth Amendment. Now, I asked Jonathan just a month ago, I said, well, you know, that didn't hit the, I mean, that was the National Press Club. I assume there was some journalists there. And there were. Big story. It completely ignored. So, for services rendered, General Hayden gets picked by George Bush to be head of the CIA now. You know, he's been head of the NSA. He's shown what he can do. Now he's going to be head of the CIA because Porter Goss had just fallen on his face. Okay, they needed a new body in there. So on the 8th of May, 2006 now, George Bush nominated Hayden to be head of the CIA. Now on that same day, right here in New York at the Public Library, there was a meeting with James Ryzen and Bobby Ray Inman, an admiral who is pretty much almost sainted by people in Washington as being the purest, the most full of integrity director that NSA ever had. And what does Bobby Ray Inman say? He says that Hayden clearly violated the law. I know because I helped draft the law, and I even inserted into that law, he's talking about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, I inserted into that law, no one is permitted to do anything that is not expressly permitted in this law. It's Bobby Ray Inman. 8th of May, okay? The same day that Hayden is nominated to be head of the CIA. Now what happens? Nobody prints that. The New York Times sort of forgot about that. But you know what? There was a blogger there, Steve Clemens, and he put it out in his blog, and I read it, and so did our friend Amy Goodman. Okay. So on the 17th of May, Amy has this big clips from how, you know, from this miserable performance, where, you know, it's just so obvious that things were very, very much askew. And so Inman is on the hook there. He has endangered Hayden's prospects for being confirmed as the CIA director. It's just a week before the hearings start. Now, this is kind of fun because I had a front row seat for this. I had a little debate with Rumsfeld on the 4th of May, and what's his name? Lou Dobbs wanted to talk to me on the 8th of May. And so I'm up there in New York in the green room, and in rushes Bobby Ray Inman. No tie on, I've never seen him so disheveled. Somebody one of his worshipers puts on a tie, you know, and I said, Admiral Inman, great job at the public library, give it to them, because I knew that the subject was whether Hayden should be CIA director. So I'm sitting back there, you know, quite acquiescing in Inman taking part of my time with Lou Dobbs, you know. I'm watching the screen there, and Dobbs says, well, how do you feel about General Hayden being the head of the CIA? And Inman says, couldn't pick a better guy. He is really terrific, technically proficient, just an incredible officer, and blah, 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 okay? Well, he opens the door, and goes out of the... How'd you change your mind there, Bobby, in 1 week? How'd you change your mind? You know damn well why he changed his mind. He got the orders from Washington, the old club, to make sure that he changed his spiel there, so when it went before the Senate, Hayden would be confirmed, which he was a week later. Now, I'm running out of time here, but I'll just say that that during this period of time, General Bill Odom, Army General, head of NSA between 85 and 88, a real straight shooter, Bill can attest to that. When he found out what Hayden had done, when he found out right after Reisen's article, he blurted out to an interviewer who's a friend of mine, Hayden should be court-martialed and Bush should be impeached. That's how important it was that the Fourth Amendment should be kept sacrosanct. So I'll just kind of finish here by saying that there are things that we can do here. And it's not all hopeless, and we shouldn't be in despair. These people are human beings, and we still have a certain amount of freedom, okay? So, we got to take the money away from NSA. It almost happened. It almost happened, and Nancy Pelosi and Boehner and Reid and all those guys said, no, let them... 8 votes, I think it was, wasn't it? 12. We can change 12 votes, okay? Number 2, they need a lot of water and electricity out there at Bluffdale. No, I mean work through the local government there, of course, but you can see the possibilities there. Okay, how about unfunding the FISA court? These faux judges they pretend to be Article 3 judges, and they're not. They're nothing. They're rubber stamps, as you know. And how about bird-dogging people like Michael Hayden, Alexander? I mean, these guys violated their oath, the oath that we all took, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I think it's our job to hold them accountable because our president doesn't have the guts to. He's afraid of them, but we the people can do it if we show the guts to do it. Thanks very much.
Ray skimmed over his debate with Rumsfeld, but that was not a scheduled debate. That was a situation where Ray was in the audience when Rumsfeld was speaking, and he really challenged him on Iraq in a masterful way by bringing out Rumsfeld's own words. And I think what you mean by bird dogging is politically challenging, you know, these heads of the state repression. This is really important, and I just wanted to introduce Stephanie Rugoff, standing here, who is the director of World Can't Wait's project called War Criminals Watch, which actually does this. If you go to warcriminalswatch.org, you can see a list of all the public appearances of mainly the Bush regime war criminals, but we are starting to add in Petraeus and so forth, because they are becoming the Obama administration war criminals as well. And we're challenging them politically on the basis of their lies. It's really important. So if you want to know more about this, see Stephanie. I won't forget our sisters in Code Pink, and there's many people doing good work. Stephanie organized this panel, and tomorrow actually Medea is going to be speaking on another panel World Can't Wait did on drones, and I hope you'll all look at the list. The third presenter that we have today that we're very glad to have is Abi Hassen from the National Lawyers Guild. and he's going to be speaking about some of the implications of the surveillance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you guys for such a great overview. I guess I want to start with a question. How many people have heard someone say, "I have nothing to hide, so I'm not worried about this," right? And I just, I was here about a year ago, and this stuff had just come out, and the idea of this is to kind of look at this a year later. How have things changed, and where are we going? And I think that question is really important, that we all, as people who are activists and organizers in this room, are able to counter that, right? And really, that's not even the question to ask, right? I don't care what you have to hide. That's not the point. It's who has the power to watch, right? It's about that power, and that's really the way we have to frame it to understand where we're at and where we're going. So I hope that no one says that anymore. They probably do, but really, it's important to reframe that. Like as Bill mentioned, that power to surveil, the power of mass surveillance, is something that I really think no society in human history has grappled with. I mean, that technological power has never existed before, and the closest, maybe, in the Middle Ages they banned the wizards or something, but there's no reality that's ever been, it's unfathomed power, really. And so we're at a time, there are no clear answers, that we're going to have to come up with the answers of how we deal with this. Let me ask everyone another question. How many of you consider yourselves to be criminals?
Depending on the criteria.
So a follow-up question. How many of you know how many federal laws there are? How many federal criminal laws are there? Just someone give me a guess. So, yeah, I'll tell you right now, all your guesses are as good as the legal experts. Like, nobody actually knows the answer to this question, right? So that actually has fundamental implications when you're talking about a mass surveillance society, right? The law actually cannot be applied equally. It is not possible for the law to be applied equally. It is applied through arbiters who are police, law enforcement, prosecutors, right? And so, we have, somewhere between 23,000 pages was one of the surveys of the federal law that was done in the 80s, right? And they just, they love to write. So, I don't know how much it's exploded since then, but someone who actually studied this intensively, John Baker at Louisiana State University, here's a quote from him. He said, "There is no one in the United States over age 18 who cannot be indicted for some federal crime." Right? So it's really a matter of who do they want to arrest? Who do they want to indict? Who do they want to catch? And when they have everyone's communications indefinitely, that power is amplified to like I said before, unfathomable extent. And we know also, it was a common line of the administration, of the various crooks and liars in the administration, that they would always say, well, this has never been abused, right? Obama, I think, said no one is reading your emails, right? That was their line early on, and before they really knew probably the extent of what Snowden had released. They still don't know the extent of what he's released, which should say something about how much we should trust them with this information, that they don't even know what was taken from them, right? The only reason they know it exists is because he made it public and didn't sell it to the Chinese or the Russians, right? So it's an interesting criticism of theirs that they say that, but so we already know this has been abused. Love-int is a term of art within the NSA, which means spying on your lovers or potential lovers, or stalking your ex-girlfriend, right? Like, as Bill also mentioned, the DEA retroactively creating search warrants. They get NSA intel, and then they tell the local cops, hey, go arrest this guy for a parking light, but they know they have the goods. That is such a fundamental violation of our constitutional system. that to me it's shocking that it's just like, okay, shut that thing down, right? Like shut them down, because that's just that's just tearing the Constitution to shreds. And another thing that has also been exposed to the Snowden revelations, I think, should be scary to all of us, are these embarrassment plots where they've targeted people and gained their gathered up their communications and of their porn watching habits or dirty sex messages, right? That type of tactic is so reminiscent of the 60s and 70s COINTELPRO and similar programs that were used against the bad guys of the time, the communists. Martin Luther King, for example, famously was sent a letter by J. Edgar Hoover trying to expose extramarital affair. So it's important to understand that these things, as we learn about them at the NSA level, and the few stories we've had of the DEA or other law enforcement using them, that these things will always, eventually, the only way to think about it is, do I want the cop on the corner to have this information? Because that's where it's going, and there's no way that they're going to build this kind of system and not use it. It's kind of like, Field of Dreams. If you build it, right, that's the fundamental issue. If you build it, it's going to get used and it's going to get abused. I'll give an example. We've seen a few examples of, through the post 9/11 anti-terrorism law enforcement structure, one of the things that was built is called a fusion center, and that's there's I think there's over 100 of them around the country, and that's where the nexus of federal to local law enforcement and a heavy corporate community tie-in also. So the fusion centers we've seen. We only get little bits of what's actually going on, mostly through like really sloppy police work or really diligent Freedom of Information Act work. So one example in Austin, Texas with Occupy Austin was infiltrated with six undercover police officers, and through records requests out of criminal charges that came against some of those Occupy activists, they found out, they were charged with some felony for doing like a lockdown kind of thing. And then they did a bunch of records requests at the Fusion Center and basically found out that one of the undercovers that had been infiltrating Occupy Austin actually built the mechanism that they locked themselves, which was like a PVC pipe, and they locked their hands together, right? But then they were charged with felony for using a criminal instrument, they called that, built by the police, right? And then the police officer said, well, I wanted to build it to make sure they were safe. And that's the line that they give every time. Another case, a really important federal court case that's happening in Washington State, a group called Port Militarization Resistance out of Olympia, Washington. They were basically peaceniks. Like they would sit in front of tanks. Like that's what they did. They were dedicated to nonviolence, and they would find out when armaments were being shipped through civilian ports to Iraq and Afghanistan, and they would sit in front of the tank. And that was the extent of their criminal activity, which was civil disobedience, obviously. But they also did rallies and anti-war protests. They did a lot of things. They were infiltrated by an Army employee named John Towery for years. He was in their group, organizing with them. He had access to all their communications, all their emails, and he was sending it straight to the Army and through the Fusion Center. Some of the documents have been released. This case was only found out about again through very diligent Freedom of Information requests and kind of sloppy police work, kind of where the Army wants to make everything a secret, but the local cops kind of are like, they want to show that they're with the Army. They want to be tough guys. So they are a little more verbose and a little more loose with their documents. So this a researcher got a hold of it, and so one of these activists, it was put on a domestic terrorist list, right? And the description was he got aggressive at a protest, and that was a justification to put him on a terrorist list, right? So and he wasn't even Muslim, right? Like, so it's really it shows the kind of that this stuff is never going to stay at the federal level. It's always going to creep down, and these terms, terrorism, radicalizer, all these terms that they use to justify these things are stretched to the point of absurdity, right? Like, I mean, I joke about the term terrorism. I think it's a term that actually has no definition. At least legally it doesn't. I mean, it has a very real cultural definition. It's like they're looking at me. But, so what, I just want to, I'll wrap up in a minute here, but I think we really need to challenge, what does a surveillance society look like? And I think that it creates what this type of surveillance and what having so much information online and in digital format creates is it creates a society where there's a whole new spectrum of privilege and elites, right? Where we create a class of elites who are allowed to be forgotten, whose pasts, with people with particular access or enough influence, can maybe get their information erased, or not searched. But the rest of us are stuck with every act and deed or potential crime that we've ever committed. And mind you, you've all committed a crime, I promise you. That will never be erased from your history. It's like, think about it like a credit score or something, where we're creating that type of infrastructure and information on all of us, but with drastic, it's not like you're going to get denied the prepaid phone. You're going to get denied a job, you don't even know. I mean, think about how the no-fly list has been implemented. One of the biggest cases, a woman in California litigated for 7 years because she was put on a no-fly list, right? They don't give you any answers. There's no straightforward way to challenge it, and it turns out it's a clerical error after 7 years, right? So that's kind of a really important aspect of what this type of mass surveillance will create in our society. I think it's interesting to note that in Europe there's like this right to forget law that's going through that is forcing data providers to actually erase stuff. And it has like drastic consequences for who could run for office, right? I don't know if this is good or bad, but Bill Clinton probably could have got through under a system like this. I mean, maybe we'd be in a better place without, but but if you think about the people who could get through, it's like either the people who can have enough influence to not have their information exposed, or the people who are so boring and unexperienced and just uninteresting that that has its own set of problems, right? I mean, so I just to close up, I just want to think about a little thought experiment here. Like, when I go to DC, I'm always struck. They've just opened a new Martin Luther King memorial. And I always think when I see it, I think like if they really wanted to make a Martin Luther King memorial, they'd scrape J. Edgar Hoover's name off the FBI building, right? Like those two things cannot exist in the same city. They're like a mile apart, right? And it's like thesis, antithesis. What would have happened if the Alabama Fusion Center had gotten a hold of all of SNCC's, not emails, but telephone calls or communications, right? Like, if we look at some of the great movements of our history, what does it mean if they could have been nipped at the bud and pulled over? Instead of marching to Selma, it's being pulled over. Everyone gets pulled over for traffic stops and spends a few nights in the clink, and the whole thing is disorganized. Like, that power exists. And, J. Edgar Hoover did a lot with what he had, right? Yeah. But he didn't have the ability to go backwards in time. They had to put agents on people. They had to really put a lot of legwork into trying to destroy Martin Luther King. And they ultimately didn't succeed. They did succeed with the Black Panthers to a large extent. But so I think it has, we can look at our past and not too distant to really understand what this power magnified could look like. And so I guess just to say what is it that we can do? I think there's some lessons, a year later, there's some lessons. One lesson is individuals matter, right? Like, individual acts could be massive, right? Sometimes they're not, but they can be, and you don't know, and you have to do what is right. You have to just keep doing it. And, and I think also, every time I look at that picture of Edward Snowden with the EFF hoodie, right? It's like organizations matter. Building these organizations and supporting these organizations matters, right? And the ideas that are promoted are important. People like Edward Snowden, they needed access to the ideas of the free internet, and and people need to be promoting those things in whatever ways, right? So, and I think the other thing we've learned is that we need to learn about encryption. I know it's scary, but we all need to learn about encryption, and that lesson is being taken to heart. I mean, I even heard that Google is talking about doing encryption. I don't know if I would trust it necessarily, but if they do, they're talking about doing end-to-end encryption. That's not something they were contemplating a year ago, right? Not even in jest, because it goes against their entire business model. But we're at a point in history where we need to start understanding that, because if everyone was encrypting, that would force the NSA to be targeted, right? Because, at the end of the day, there's nothing that's 100%. You're never going to get 100% digital security. I mean, it's just not possible. The NSA is very smart. They're very powerful, and they can, if they want to individually get you, they're going to get you. But that's not the point. The point is, if we're all using encryption, they can't just. They won't have that ability to go back through our history, and we control, the term I like to use is called data sovereignty, where we have sovereignty over our data. And so I think that the last thing, that I think it's important that we, especially activists and people on the left and people who are interested in social justice movements, really start to bridge the gap between the technology and the free internet and the social justice, because those two things, and they back and forth. I think I'm a member of an organization called May 1st People Link that is I think a good example of bridging those gaps. But I think that we all need to really make affirmative steps to try to build relationships and understand what our data is doing and where we're putting our data, and support the organizations. I'll name a few. Rise Up, the Guardian Project is, the Dark Mail is a project that Ladar Levinson, a guy who the FBI tried to take who supposedly Edward Snowden was using his email. We need to support these organizations and help build them and make them part of our movements. So, thank you.
Thanks for that thought experiment. You think about this country mass incarcerating at a higher rate than any other country in the world, and the implications of what you brought out are really important. Our last presenter is Kevin Gosztola, who you can follow at the Dissenter blog at firedoglake.com, and we also stream it live at worldcan'twait.net. Kevin.
Yeah, so I want everybody to have some opportunity to get in here with questions, so I won't let my presentation drone on too long. But I guess I'll begin by saying it's very refreshing to me that I don't have to start off by debunking the fear-mongering that has come from anonymous government officials who like to talk into the ears of the establishment journalists in the media, because it definitely does seem like what they have said for the longest time has dominated in the news media, but most of you already believe that they're lying. So I don't have to get into everything that they've said about the system, but what I do think is important to emphasize is why it is important that we have all of this documentation, and why it is so important that we don't just say to ourselves, oh, well, if you talked to me a year or 2 years ago, I would have suspected that all of this was happening. I knew just based off the Bush administration, and I could kind of tell from President Obama that he probably hadn't ended it, and I knew that these sort of things were happening. But as a journalist, I don't get to just, I'm not supposed to, I know some of my colleagues do, but we're supposed to not speculate. We're supposed to deal in fact and actually have something to back up the statements that we're making. So in order to talk about dragnet surveillance, it's helpful to have documents that show that you have these servers located all around the world that are intercepting people's data, and that they are in fact being targeted and without suspicion, and that the people are, everyone without probable cause are the targets. So that's important. And I think that we should look at how the attention to the NSA has been vastly amplified in the last year. And I actually went through and put together a statistic through a database that's very popular among journalists here in the country. It's called LexisNexis. And I went and I looked, and I was just curious to see what the difference would be. So between June 2nd, 2012 through June 1st, 2013, if you looked at news wires, if you looked at newspapers, web-based publications, magazines, journals, news or news transcripts, those are the different categories, and you combine them all together and you looked at how many times NSA, just that NSA was mentioned between June 2nd, 2012 and June 1st, 2013, there were 675 mentions in this database. Now, if you look at the time from June 2nd, 2013 to today, that number with all those same categories is 6,955 mentions. So we have 1,000% increase in the amount of attention to this agency that for the most part people in the country weren't looking into. If you looked at journalists, there wasn't a lot of interest in covering what the agency was up to. And I think it's probably for a combination of reasons. I mean, we all have become very aware. Well, I think actually if you just take it on a personal level for citizens here in the country, NSA has this overwhelming issue that they're dealing with where people are sending in FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests for their own data, saying, I want to know what kind of information you have on me. And of course, they reject that. But that's the case. NSA has historically believed that they are not an agency that has to respond to the Freedom of Information Act, that they are exempt from this law. And so in order to get any sort of records, you have to file some kind of a lawsuit and have, it helps to do some high-profile litigation. And so you have very few news organizations that are engaging in that sort of activity prior to Edward Snowden coming forward. And you have the reality that you're just, that there's not a whole lot of interest in getting into this. I mean, even when you have a court case moving up to the Supreme Court challenging warrantless surveillance, most of the news media are not taking these people seriously, even though they have names like Naomi Klein of The Nation and people in law firms who have represented high-profile terrorism suspects and people who are representing others in human rights organizations, even though they are, I think, influential people who deserve some attention. There's just a lot of ignorance and not caring about what they were doing. So I think it's important to think about that. And then I suppose one of the things to bring up here is how I believe it has shifted. I believe that there has been this shift, and I watched it when I viewed I think many of you probably watched it, when Edward Snowden did his exclusive interview with NBC News this past week. And while there was something really, really absurd to me about NBC News sort of like running into the room and shouting about all this stuff they had just found out, which most of us had already heard if we were paying attention to The Guardian, I also recognized that this was a huge deal because there are hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of Americans who had never gotten to hear Edward Snowden speak at all before. And so now they were able to hear him articulate and defend himself. And I also thought, what kind of media were they probably reading and digesting and viewing in the last year? And it was probably that meathead Mike Rogers getting on Meet the Press, and it was probably Michael Hayden being on, and Dianne Feinstein, and all these people who just get called in on these Sunday morning news programs to talk about their view of what's going on, and Peter King, this like vile man, Peter King, being asked to come in and talk about his views, and so they had never heard anybody. They had never heard from Ed Snowden, and understandably, for a year, he didn't want to be the story. But I think a year later, this was a good, appropriate time to come forward and explain to the American people, what he was doing on his broadcast. He had done the waiting game and had gotten NBC News to a point where they would basically let him say whatever he wanted to say, and that was a pretty good strategy. And so he was able to speak his mind. And I think one of the things that was fascinating to me was not really even the interview, actually. It was the post-show, which I watched on the internet, and I don't think a lot of people saw it, but it was actually kind of fascinating to me because these establishment journalists, I could tell in their minds, they were contemplating these national security state issues that they had never even thought about before. Like, for the first time in this hour program that they had set up here, they were thinking about these really critical issues of like the Fourth Amendment, and they were thinking of these things that Edward Snowden had said, and even the people who were, I guess, the pro-government people. They had this former ambassador, Michael McFaul, and they had Michael Leiter, who used to be the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, and they both were talking and spouting the pro-government view that we would expect, but what they were doing was they were debunking what Edward Snowden had said. So it wasn't them that got to frame the debate. It was now Edward Snowden who had framed the discussion here in this post show. And that was a first, I think, to actually talk about things as in, the burden is on you to prove that Edward Snowden is wrong. And I've seen that. And I think that's why we had the sort of chauvinistic, jingoistic comments that we got from Secretary of State John Kerry, because I think they're very frustrated. Everything that Edward Snowden is doing is really having an impact and influencing and changing everything. So there's a whole list that I made of things that have come out in the past year with everything that has been released. I think one thing that I'll highlight is just a couple examples of people who have been harmed. I saw this liberal journalist who writes for The Guardian saying something during the exclusive interview. Can anyone prove that NSA surveillance has harmed anyone up to this point? As if to discourage people from being interested in this interview. And I said, yes, yeah, actually we can prove that. And you mentioned this, it was the story that was published in the Huffington Post about how they were targeting the porn viewing habits of radical Muslims with the intention, the clear intention of actually getting these people to shut up and stop talking within their communities. And they recognized that they were not terrorists, but because of their extremist views and how influential they were becoming in their communities, the NSA and the wider U.S. government was apparently concerned that these were people they needed to eliminate and neutralize. But they weren't going to drone them, I guess. They were going to try to embarrass them with their porn viewing habits. And the other thing, and this hasn't gotten a lot of attention either, but there were some internal NSA documents that Glenn Greenwald wrote about for The Guardian that showed how the NSA had pegged opponents of drone strikes as threats or adversaries, and had complained that people who were showing that they were upset about these groups that have legal opposition that promote the sort of arguments that drone strikes are outside the boundaries of international law, that this is in fact a part of a propaganda campaign on the part of terrorists. And actually said, and this is a quote, that one of the propaganda themes to look out for is that, quote, attacks against American and European persons who have become violent extremists are often criticized by propagandists, arguing that lethal action against these individuals deprives them of due process. So this is supposed to be propaganda, that you are not given due process. They also, I think, they're sort of projecting too in this document, because they mention that they don't like that we use the word drone because it undermines their ability to just randomly target and assassinate and kill people. But they themselves freak out if you use the word drone, and like anytime that they're invited to a conference and the word drone is involved in the headline or the title of your panel, they'll always give this really long-winded disclaimer about how they're not going to use the word drone in their presentation. And what other word they're going to use. They have like a bunch of different acronyms that they want to use. They haven't even settled on the one acronym that they want to use to propagandize us with. They just keep coming up with different combinations of things to use. So in the past year, some major things that we've seen happen are that we have more declassification of materials, because having these programs out in the open for us to read about and having our public officials have to acknowledge them in the process of doing their little shell game reform efforts in Congress, they themselves have given in and let groups like the Electronic Frontier Foundation actually get documents in response. And those documents that Obama administration likes to claim credit for having released are actually the product of a judge granting a court order, issuing a court order and saying that, you have to release these documents. And then the government chose not to fight that, but they chose to not fight that because then they could come out and claim to all of us that they're suddenly being transparent, and we should congratulate them. And so now we have many more materials that we can look at from them about how they were defending doing this sort of activity. And then we can also see some of the secret surveillance court opinions. And then also importantly, I want to raise that in this past year, because of all of these disclosures, you now have a situation where people who are charged with crimes, particularly terrorism, can try to push for access to FISA materials, to the surveillance records that were collected, and in fact, there's a case in Chicago that I'll be covering. I'm going to one of the earlier pretrial hearings on Wednesday, and his name is Adel Daoud, and he is basically your typical sort of terrorist pumped out of the FBI's factory of manufactured terrorism, as we have come to see that they have hundreds upon hundreds of these people who basically this individual is about 18, and he was on a jihadi web forum, and you're just talking to people, and then the FBI informant decides that, or one of these agents decide this is the person we're going to manipulate and try to get them involved in committing some type of a terrorist attack on a local Chicago bar. And so now for the first time, the lawyer has actually been successful, and the government is very alarmed that there's a situation where it could be incredibly precedent-setting, and the defense has actually achieved the judge saying you should have access to this material, and they've given them access to all of these secret surveillance records that the government for the longest time in the last decades has been able to prevent any defense attorney from getting their hands on. And so now the government is completely panicked, and that hearing is going to be them just expressing all of this outrage about why they shouldn't, why the defense shouldn't get these records. But the ACLU has and EFF has filed a brief in this because they see the importance of breaking this history. So the final point I want to make here is just that, Gore Vidal used to say that we're the United States of amnesia. And I see a lot of things happening now, and then when I read stuff that was written back in the 1970s, it's incredible how identical it is to, between 1970s and then today. It's actually, it seems like they just copied and pasted certain official records and just like came and brought them back out. And so I noticed that while this isn't the NSA, in the Church Committee's report, one of the things that they put down in this book 3 is that the legal theories advanced to justify use of warrantless wiretapping were entirely developed almost entirely by the executive branch itself, legitimized by the reluctance of Congress and the Supreme Court to confront these officials directly. That's exactly what happened in the last 10 years here. And I guess some people could argue that that's what was happening in the 1990s and that's what was happening in the 1980s, and we just, by luck, we had some people in these agencies that backed off and weren't doing it as zealously. And so the other thing is that in this book that I picked up, called Lawless State, The Crimes of the U.S. Intelligence Agencies, which was put out and was looking at all of these different agencies back in the 1970s. One of the things that they put in the book about the NSA is that they're making this claim that anything they accidentally collect on Americans is okay because they weren't targeting these people. And so anything that's incidental is great. We can just have it in our database and keep it because it just happens to be useful. And that's the claim that they make today, that they can do anything accidentally or incidentally, and if they just happen to keep it. And that's what I think stood out. One of the things that stood out from the Edward Snowden interview was that he was saying that something he doesn't like is the dirtiness of the way the agency operates and how there is this lack of care about being specific and targeting people and not letting and sweeping up the data of every single person. So those are the points that I wanted to make, and thank you very much.
Wow, only 5 hands so far. Okay, here's how we're going to do this. We can stay in this room beyond 1:50 because nothing follows us for an hour. Doesn't mean we have all day, but don't worry. I would like to take 2 questions or comments at a time, and then I will ask the panelists if they'd like to answer or speak to either, and I will try to get to everybody. I would just like to say a very important point off the last 2 presentations, really all of this. What does it say when the biggest intelligence gathering apparatus in the history of the globe, which is built on the biggest military in the history of the globe, is brought to somewhat of an embarrassing standstill by someone who's 29 years old? And I'm not speaking about age, I'm speaking about vulnerability. What does it say when the whole world saw the collateral murder video because of the actions of Chelsea Manning, who was inside the system? It shows that these systems are, number one, fundamentally illegitimate, unjust, immoral, and that there are people inside the system who get that. And we really cherish that. It's important what Edward Snowden and Bradley Manning did, and what WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and all the journalists in the room are doing. So I'm going to start with the first hand I saw. We'll work from this side to that side. We'll take Danny Schechter. Danny Schechter, the news dissector.
I was going to ask this question of Siri, but I can't seem to reach her right now. But I noticed that of the panels canceled today, one is called Why the Left Can't Learn, which I find rather significant. The point is, are we doing enough? We're talking about these issues, that's good. We're reading about them in Greenwald's book, that's good. But are we acting on this issue in any kind of way? And I have an idea that I'm looking for some help with, which is a public reading, perhaps on Broadway, at some prominent venue, of the Snowden documents, with prominent actors as well as activists. And if there's anybody interested in helping with this, please see me and give me your name and email. The question I had was, is it because of the Obama administration? But it seems like people like Rand, I won't mention his last name, are taking the lead, in trying to organize against this on the right. Who is doing it among the Democrats and the liberals? Are they all being silenced by the Obama administration? I'd love to know what you think.
Okay, so hold that question and we'll take one more to put into the mix here.
Larry Everest, Revolution newspaper. Listen, I feel like Snowden and all these revelations are the gift that keeps on giving. You know, it's incredibly important. But I think it reveals more than simply some officials are lying. I think it reveals the lie that this is a democracy based on the will of the people. In fact, we're living in a dictatorship of the capitalist class in which elections, courts, constitutions, whatever, serve that dictatorship. And if you understand that, it makes total sense why. What's the most shocking revelation? They're not spying on terror. They're spying on everybody. Why? Well, if you ran an empire that was destroying the earth, waging war after war, locking up black and brown people, assaulting women, and all the rest, you realize you have billions of potential enemies, and you want information on them ahead of time. And that's, I think, sure, there are people making money on it, but I think that's the essential thing we've got to confront. That's the nature of this, and that it's going to take a revolution to change this. And just, you know, I'm not going to go on further about this. The Revolutionary Communist Party's building actively now. Speaking of Danny, what are we doing? A movement for revolution. Part of this is supporting whistleblowers. Part of it's fighting mass incarceration. And also, if you want to talk about terror, why not talking about the terrorizing of women who try to exercise their fundamental right to choose? What about that terrorism? And, you know, if I could just sit... No, I have a comment. They can say whatever they want. But the only other thing I'd like to say, a comment was made from the front that we don't know how to do something better. I suggest we do. Take a look at this Constitution for a new socialist republic.
So panelists want to respond to any of either question. What about the Democrats fighting this?
I would.
What about the question of what kind of system do we have, I guess? Go ahead, Bill.
I was going to say that there was a movement last July to unfund the NSA, and that was a joint effort between Republicans and Democrats in the House. That was Amos and Conyers coming together to try, and they had a lot of support. In fact, the administration really worked hard to turn that around, and they succeeded, but they only did it by 12 votes. So that was a coalition that was forming up. In fact, I was supposed to brief them on this program and how it works, so they'd have a better understanding, you know. And when I got on the congressional record, the date and time, that's when President Obama called a meeting of all the Democrats in the House at that same time. So he killed the meeting. Right? He killed them getting any briefing on how this worked. So eventually, because he and General Alexander lobbied that House very hard at that time to stop that motion, they lost, or unfunding lost by 12 votes. But they came very close, and since more Snowden materials come out, I think now Representative Amos thinks he has the votes. But it's a joint effort. So I think there's some coalition occurring there on that question.
But I would just say that I think, to the point that I think Danny's trying to make, that I believe that there probably are numerous Democrats and or liberal organizations that are being silent because the person in the White House is President Barack Obama. And that has been the typical behavior and conduct of people since he was inaugurated, or even actually going far back to when he was running his election campaign. Because, I mean, I think a lot of people have mentioned this, but we should never forget that President Obama said in the summer, before he was elected, that he was going to vote against the FISA Amendments Act, that he was going to be opposed to retroactive immunity for people in the NSA who had engaged in warrantless wiretapping, as well as immunity for the telecommunications companies. And then he turned around because what was the logo on the Democratic Convention Center in the state, in Denver, where he was going to be having the convention? It was AT&T. And so he voted for this legislation, and it's basically the big part of, I mean, I think Bill probably can attest to it, legalized a lot of the surveillance.
I maintain that none of this is legal, simply because it's not constitutional.
Right.
No law you cannot pass a law that authorizes an unconstitutional act. That's exactly what they've been doing. And they're all they've been trying very hard to keep Jewell versus NSA challenging the constitutionality of all this data being collected out of the Supreme Court. And the reason they're doing that is because if it goes through and it gets ruled unconstitutional, their whole house of cards falls. Everything.
Yeah, I'll just make one comment. I appreciate. I mean, obviously this is left forum, so but that you call it the Democrats, not the left. The liberals and the Democrats, not the left. Like there's there's a very big difference, right? The people, the left doesn't have any senators, so
No. Thank you.
But
Bernie.
yeah, Bernie. We got Bernie. Yeah,
Part of the system.
but
Part of the system.
yeah, but I think you make a point that it always reminds me of it's not an old. This is not something new, right? James Madison, to quote James Madison, no nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare, and that is an insight that it never keeps giving. That insight, right? That is just the necessities of war do not jive with the necessities of freedom. Like they're at a fundamental contract, and the more war we have, and the more we need to violate someone's rights, the more those mechanisms will be used on us. And it's like if you build the world's biggest army, you're gonna go to war. If you build the world's biggest spy operation, you're gonna spy on people.
Okay, working. I had this one, and then you with the orange band on. Yes, second.
Okay. Hi, I recognize a lot of you. Debra, thank you so much. I love your emails. Everyone, your work is phenomenal. I remember you from previous years. I just want to say, okay, so Dream Seed, we can do anything. How would we use these machinations of absolute scrutiny of knowing who contacted who and who contacted who to, as the National Defense Authorization Act specifically says, persecute those directly responsible for the effects of 9/11. I think if a lot of people in this room know that if we had, say, Larry Silverstein's records for the 90 days previous, we would know some things. So, in other words, what is the oversight for them on the top to delete their own accounts? And then outside of that, what little fraction of one tiny percent could do an internal investigation and actually look at some of the larger scale crimes? In other words, rather than just us worrying about our privacy, how could these tools of knowledge, of truth, of transactions and actual relationships be used for internal investigation and corruption clean sweep?
Okay, and you in the back? Yeah.
So recently there was an issue between WikiLeaks and The Intercept, where I don't know if people know, but they released a big story about full-scale surveillance against 5 different countries. Washington Post ran the story, didn't list any of the countries. The Intercept ran the story, only lists 4 of the 5 countries. And then Julian Assange and Greenwald had a big battle about whether or not they should have printed the 5th country. And Greenwald said that they had very credible information from the government that would have caused harm to somebody. Well, not clear. I mean, I wasn't in on those conversations. So, yeah, the 5th country was Afghanistan, as WikiLeaks ended up releasing eventually. So I wanted to get a little perspective from Mr. Binney from the national security perspective, and maybe from Mr. Gosztola about sort of the journalistic perspective of. So I think we all agree that what the New York Times did with the Rising story was ridiculous, but is there should there be any deference ever to the government in publishing these documents? No deference ever, a little bit of deference. What's your feeling from a national security perspective, and then from a journalistic perspective?
Go ahead. I have a pretty easy answer for this one. Everybody spies on everybody. So sure, we spy on every country in the world. What difference does it make whether or not you release a name or not of a country? Because we're spying on it. It's that simple.
I mean, from your angle,
from my angle,
was there ever a time where you would say
the things
they should not publish this?
Yeah, the things to not publish. The things to not publish are the specific things, like for example, Osama bin Laden's Inmarsat phone number. That should not have been published because that took away that resource. We were watching him, reading everything he was saying, where he was, all this stuff on that phone, and we were following that cast iron. When that was exposed, that disappeared. That hurts. Okay, but talking about will we spy on everybody? I mean, just because we spy on Chancellor Merkel's phone, I mean everybody does. I mean, I'm sure we're not the only ones listening to her phone. I mean, the Russians are. I'm sure the French. They all are. So the point is that that's not to be. She should have been advised by her security people that she is a target. She's the leader of a major country in the world. That's obvious. So you're going to be a target. And you're going to be spied on. So protect yourself, and they should have given her some form of protection. So that's not to be, that's nothing that shouldn't be understood by everybody in the world. But when you get into specifics of where you were successful, that hurts in terms of, like the fact that we do PRISM, or the fact that we have an upstream collection program. Everybody understood we did that. That doesn't hurt at all. The fact that we're doing it against terrorism, everybody, I mean, Osama bin Laden's phone number was exposed back in the 90s, and since then they've known we watch phones and emails. They know that all along. So they're not affected at all by that. Just the fact that we're collecting it was and keeping it secret was to keep it away from us, the public of the United States. So I mean, there's some really a worldwide understanding of how espionage and intelligence works. It's just that maybe not everybody understands that.
Journalistically, I see both sides of it, and I actually think that basically what we just need to preserve in the system is the ability for you to make the choice. Okay, so if I want to publish something and I've done a good analysis of what it is that I'm going to release, and I have looked into it and I think I'm on solid ground to release it without hurting any people, then I think I should be able to release it, and anything that the government does against me is something that we all should probably oppose. I think in general I feel comfortable making that argument. Like, on the other hand, if I've looked into it and I have the sense that somebody is going to be exposed and it's going to perhaps violate the trust of my source, in particular in this situation, we don't have to talk in the abstract. One of the main points that Glenn Greenwald has made about not releasing certain details is the fact that Edward Snowden entrusted him with making these decisions, and he feels this huge obligation to be very careful about what he's putting out, and that everything that is released has a clear public interest element. And if someone in the government gives a good, coherent case for why it's going to hurt individuals, that be treated with care. On the other hand, I see completely the argument from, I guess it's coming from the left, but maybe I could say it's just coming from a human rights perspective, because, you know, all of these countries, because we're talking about this in the context of a story where it was revealed that we were collecting the phone call conversations of people in the Bahamas, Kenya, Mexico, Philippines, and then the fifth country was unnamed, although what happened is WikiLeaks went ahead and said, we know the name of the country through sources which we're not going to say how exactly we know, but we're pretty sure it's Afghanistan. And they didn't give any more information to contextualize that. They just said, that's the name. Well, so, I mean, I had given this a lot of thought, and one of the things that is clear is, you know, we have had a military occupation there in Afghanistan, and there's a lot of debate and discussion about whether we should be there, and I happen to, you know, for the longest time I have not supported being there and continuing the military occupation. I feel comfortable saying that, but anybody there in that country should probably get to know if they're being subjected to a dragnet, insofar as their officials maybe didn't tell them that they were going to have this done to them because the military was coming to occupy their country. If that wasn't part of especially if that wasn't part of the understanding that, oh, they're going to come here and they're going to rid our country of terrorists, well, but they didn't say that all of us were going to be put under dragnet surveillance, then that's a complete violation of their rights. And obviously we can talk about how anytime there's a military occupation, everyone's rights are going to be violated, and that's just what happens with people who are basically involved in colonialism. But I think that I can see both sides. I can see why you release the name of the country, and then I can see why you withhold it. And I believe that the journalist, if you respect that person, you trust that they made the appropriate decision, and you believe that they're better, at least they're a lot better than the editors at the New York Times, who you know didn't make the right decision when they withheld the warrantless wiretapping story. And actually, it was even more specific with this name of the country, if I know correctly. They were actually told that there is some company that's involved in the surveillance that would have been made vulnerable, and they believed, I guess, would be attacked. And that could be entirely bogus on down the line, but I take Glenn Greenwald's point as being very fair that you can always release information. You can't redact information that is made public.
Can I? We didn't answer the first question. The first question was looking at using the techniques against internally in the government. In fact, we made a proposal inside NSA to do exactly that. It's one of the reasons Snowden was still able to do what he did, was because they rejected our proposal. What we said was we wanted to monitor the network log, which really, every time you send if you're on a network with a computer, every time you type a line of code in, hit the return, or you click your mouse, it sends a line of code down the network log, and it gets logged in the network log. So what we wanted to do and what we proposed was we would monitor everybody on the NSA network worldwide virtually in real time, maybe a few tens of milliseconds behind, but we would be doing that monitoring of everybody in the world and see what they're doing, who's doing what, where, what they're accessing, what they're copying, whatever they're doing. And we would also monitor all the programs that we have running, all the money we're investing, and all of the return on investment that we get from different programs. So you could see whether or not your investments are good. And we ended up with only 2 groups that opposed us, which was virtually everybody in NSA. The first group were the analysts. I don't want you monitoring me. I don't want, because you might look and see and have questions about why I'm doing this, or why I'm analyzing it this way, and that's exactly the point. We wanted to say, hey, you need training here because you're not really doing the right thing. That was one of the reasons we did that. The second group were the managers at NSA. Why do they say that? Because they move money around from program to program. They want the flexibility to do whatever they want to with the money. So that, and by the way, don't you dare get return on investment on my program, because then Congress might cancel it. Right. So we had virtually total opposition. This was in 92, 93 is when we proposed this. So we could have had a totally monitoring system running back then, very shortly after that, so that Snowden, if he started downloading anything, we would have picked that up right away. Wow. But they for those reasons I just laid out, they did not want that internally at NSA, and they don't have it now. That's why I have no idea what he took.
Can files be deleted? Can files be deleted?
You really have to work at it to do that, but I think it can be done, but you really have to. In other words, there's so many backups and things like that, and there's so many ways to recover it, even after you try to destroy it.
The answers are out there.
Yeah.
I thought your question deserved an answer as well, but my answer is a little different. There's no good use of all this information on people.
No.
Absolutely no good, and we don't want to live in a country that does this, ever.
If I had a hammer, I'd hammer in the morning, I'd hammer in the evening, all over this land. I'd hammer out danger, I'd hammer out warning, I'd hammer out love between my brothers and the sisters. Whoa, this land. But if I had the bell, I'd bring it in the morning, I'd bring it in the evening, all over this land. I'd bring out danger, I'd bring out a warning, I'd bring out love between my brothers and the sisters. Oh, this